All right, we're going to get started because it's such a beautiful evening. I don't want to take up too much of the sun while it's still out. But anyway, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Elise Rosemarin. I'm a Senior Vice President here at AKAM. Tonight's conversation will be regarding residential building design, trends, and best practices. So joining me this evening, I have two fantastic panelists. We've got Marilyn Sygrove, who is a founder and lead designer of Sygrove Associates Design Group. Welcome, Marilyn. And then we also have David Nosanchuk, who pronounced it right? I hope so, who is an architect, artist, and designer, and he also owns his firm as well. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you can both just briefly tell the audience a little bit about your backgrounds, and then we'll get started on our conversation, that would be great. So I guess I'll start with you, Marilyn.
Great, thank you. I started my business in 1982, which means we are celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. And we started because buildings were converting from rental to co-ops in 82, and there was no one touching that type of work. My background is one where I was working in hotel design, which is designing public spaces. So it was actually the perfect fit for doing residential buildings, public spaces. I'm second generation interior designer. My dad was a retail store designer, so I have sort of an unorthodox background of being brought up in the business. And I love what I do, and 40 years, it's still fresh.
Fantastic. And I know you've done a ton of buildings in New York City, as well as some of our own. So thank you so much, Marilyn, and welcome. And then David, if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Thank you, Elise. My name is David Nosanchuk. I'm trained as an architect and a furniture maker. When I went to graduate school for architecture, I couldn't sit at my desk and wait 10 years to see a building or a house come to be. So I started working in the wood shop and started making and eventually teaching furniture making, which has always been a passion. So all the work that I do, be it interiors, gardens, lighting design, it's all about kind of a one-of-a-kind approach to making and design that is hopefully kind of melding together for one type of solution. So I don't focus necessarily on a particular type of design, be it residential, commercial, or multifamily. I work on projects where someone wants a one-of-a-kind solution. From the design through the construction, that's what my specialty is.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much. We're lucky to have you this evening. And I know a lot of buildings are really thinking about, you spent so much time in your homes these past few years. People are really looking at their buildings differently, I think, than they have in the past, and looking for solutions that aren't going to cost a fortune per se, but are going to really enhance their buildings, and they want to think methodically. So as an overview to our conversation this evening, we're going to be discussing, embarking on a residential building design project, what that means, how you start, elements of a good design product, supporting the design, some sample works from Marilyn and David, and then we'll do a Q&A. And like normal, we invite you to send any questions that you have during this time. We will, of course, try to answer them as they come in. We like to have them at the end just to have focus for the conversation. And if we do not touch upon anything that you have inquiry about, we'll be sure to get back to you following tonight's webinar. So just to get started, I guess we'll start with Marilyn. What's your advice for starting on a building design project? How does one begin?
Well, I suggest the building first goes to Google and finds lobby designer or hallway designer in New York City as one resource. I think going to AKAM, asking the AKAM property management team if they've had good experience with designers, because it should really be quite a short list. And what we've discovered over the years is that when we design a building, we're really branding the building from the inside out. And so we actually do an extensive information or input gathering from our clients before we even start the design process. We do it through a Meet the Designer night where I personally listen to everyone that lives in the building that's interested in the project and hear what they have to say. Doing surveys that go out to everyone. So we do a lot of extensive pre-work before actually deciding on design. We also do a preliminary budget estimate of what our vision would be with line item numbers. So that is presented to the board, and we work with them to come up with a realistic budget. And then we start the design process, which means we will prepare a number of designs for the board being the decision-making body after we do get all of this input from the residents in the community. And then we work very closely with the board, narrowing it down to a final design.
Great. So when you're doing these design projects, do you generally, how do you go about educating the board to make the decision? Is it forming a committee with, just the board, or do you generally work with the residents and the board? How do you usually work?
Great question. I have done both, which is, as I mentioned, I meet the residents in the building and do a survey, and we get information, data from them in terms of color preference, style, more seating, less seating, just general information like that. And then the preference is really to work with the board, who are the decision makers. Sometimes the board will open it up where there'll be 2 or 3 board members and a small committee comprised of what I call the civilians, who are the non-board members as well. And we like to work collaboratively with them so that we're coming up with a design that is appealing to not only most of the residents in the building, but a design that's also going to make the building more valuable, more marketable.
Right. And you were speaking about branding a building, which I definitely understand and can appreciate, because throughout a building's life cycle, it might have been built in 1950 and it might have been the most gorgeous building of its time then, but throughout time, you still need to preserve it like anything else and add value back into the building. So I definitely appreciate that. David, what are your, insights as far as this type of embarking on a project? I know that you spoke that you curate, your services, you're very bespoke. So how would you go about that?
Well, I think in any situation, it's trying to get the client or clients to see your vision, and, to think out of the box is harder for people. And, I think to get their confidence takes a lot of time. And so showing them images of inspiration to begin with, bringing samples in, but a lot of these situations, showing samples in the lobby, but the hallways upstairs, but the lighting's not right. So ultimately, I always push for like a full scale mock-up. And invariably, when someone can actually see the materials with the proper lighting, the baseboard, all the little details that maybe they thought weren't worth paying for or weren't what they thought they wanted, they can really react to something like that and hopefully like it or use it as a design tool to make a few changes. It's also a great tool for the bidding process, so a GC can actually see what you're expecting in terms of a finished product. So I think full-scale models are an invaluable tool.
Yeah, it's good to be able to, envision the space and, the reality of it. What are both of your thoughts? Sometimes doing a complete rehaul of a lobby, as an example, just isn't within a building's budget. So do you think that you do have to kind of, work the whole space, or are there improvements that you can make during, the duration of a course of several years?
I'll pick up on that one. That's a very tricky scenario. My experience has been it's really difficult to do it in pieces because it will look like it's in pieces. Certainly, some maintenance aspects of your lobby can be freshened. So paint colors cleaning wall covering or repairing wall covering, lighting, even lampshades to be replaced, small things like that. You know, I see often rain runners that are so tattered and old and beat up that go out during bad weather, and that's representing you to the world. And just so something like purchasing new rain runners or a logo mat, there are small things that you can do, fresh flowers or a live plant. There are things that you can do while you're waiting to amass the funds to be able to do a full project.
Yeah, because I mean, I guess you just don't get the full impact of the project if you're doing it piecemeal. And I know that we've spoken before, and you know, you want the quality to last for several years. So when you do these smaller piecemeal projects, you don't really necessarily get that duration. Is that
right? And I also, I mean, I have actually advised potential clients and say, if it's going to take you another year or two to put the money together to do it right, I think that's the way to go, as opposed to Band-Aids. And we all know from our own experience, our own interiors or what have you, that a Band-Aid will look like a Band-Aid. But maintenance, on the other hand, if your floors are cleaned and polished, if the paint is fresh, if you know, the nicks and scratches are taken care of by outside professionals, the maintenance is perceived. And a building that's well maintained can sort of get away with it.
How often do you recommend, you know, maintaining the paint color as the example? Is there a standard, or?
There's really not a standard. I would say, you know, you're always safe with neutrals. You're always safe if there were, you know, if you're dealing with a building from the 50s or the 60s, often there were, you know, pretty vibrant statement type of colors, and you may want to tone that down, and that alone will give visual relief when you walk in the building. In terms of a schedule, I'd probably say 3 to 5 years.
Okay. Yeah. Do you agree with that, David? It looks like you're nodding your head.
No, I think 3 to 5 years is great. I think the paints now too, depending on what you get, you know, there's some paints that are cleanable, washable. So I think that's an important thing to consider. I think Marilyn's right. Things like lighting, where you could switch out an old can for a new LED can where all the lights match. You know, you could make a huge difference with that. A conference desk or a new awning on the outside, things that's like more like a new suit than new body, you know, can make a big difference. But I do think Marilyn has like a great kind of a patient approach to, you know, it's better to do it right. You know, if you buy a nice pair of leather shoes, you polish them, but they last 15, 20 years. I mean, they really, if they're well made, then they last, you know. So, but it's like a political cycle. It's hard to convince board members that may be on the board for a couple of years or whatever. You know, you're asking someone to really plan for 5, 10, 20 years. Ideally, you know, we create a timeless design that's going to hold up that long, but that might cost X more than a design, you know, that's not built as well or thought through, and that's only going to last 5 years per se. So, you know, to get people on board with that, I think is our job, but it's not an easy job, you know. But I think it's important to, you know, to bring the client along and let them know, you know, they want something that's really not going to be a headache in the future, you know, that they can maintain.
Right. And I think it comes, so I was going to say, it's about durability, you know, it sounds, you know, you're not just picking something beautiful, but because there's a lot of traffic, you have to think about the durability of it and the finishes that can last, you know, the exposure is different than furnishing your home, you know, finishing your living room. Like, sure, it'd be beautiful to have certain materials used, but if there are a lot of people sitting on a couch, it's going to, you know, get a certain type of, you know, use as opposed to one that's just maybe in your general living room. So, you know, one thing that going back to being a former broker, you know, I think, and speaking to what you were saying, you know, there are little ways that you can update your building without costing a lot of money, like the flowers, and thinking about the sales cycle. You know, we're in spring. So if you want to really make an impact and help the people that are selling your building, it's always nice to kind of give it that fresh touch that both of you were speaking to. And I think that's an element of good design, going to what we're talking about next, and the durability. But what other, what do you think about, elements that make good design for these types of spaces? So we just said, they're not the same as a living room. It feels like a living room when you're walking to a lobby, but what makes the impact of a good design? I don't know who wants to take that first, but
I'll give it a
yeah,
shot.
sure.
So, I think, to me, especially in hallways where there's almost no natural light, usually, I think lighting is really important. The other issue is a lot of these buildings have low ceilings, and you have to figure out where the wiring goes. So a lot of the solutions can go kind of solving all those things and coming up with a lighting solution, whether it's down lights or cove lighting. And with the LEDs, again, they're not super inexpensive, but they last 15, 20 years. Some buildings can get energy rebates for that. And then once you kind of have the lighting thought through, then, I think the wall covering and the carpet would be like the next kind of the two things that kind of illuminate with that lighting. And depending on the size of the building, both the carpet and the wallpaper can be customized pretty easily. Wallpaper colors for sure. A lot of Axminster carpets can be customized in terms of pattern for not much more than a regular Axminster would cost anyway. So you spend a little more money on the design. You can also do lighting fixtures and hardware and limited production for, let's say, a 20 or 30-story building, and maybe you pay a little premium over a standard issue. But again, now everything's custom, so you spend more money on creating these things, and now you create, again, like more of a branded, complete building. Like if you were to see a Rosa Candela building, deco building with all the original kind of like hardware and lobby finishes, it's more complete and has its own personality rather than borrowing from this or that. When people look at lobbies and buildings, once they start working on their own, they want something that's their own, and so this is a way to kind of do that. But again, you need to create that kind of consensus and confidence to go that extra distance when you're doing something that's, a little more out of the box.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, also, I think that, again, the consideration of practical, versus a beautiful design. Like I remember when I was selling a building not too recent, but my most recent building, we worked with a beautiful designer, and the carpet was all ivory, and we had leather, in the elevators, and it was gorgeous, and then white marble. But, before we even launched, we had to change out the carpets because they were not durable, and the amount of foot traffic just wasn't going to absorb it. So I guess, Marilyn, for practical purposes, how do you work with boards to achieve beauty, but still, again, maintaining practical? Like, is there certain, materials you recommend or colors to stay, go towards versus away from?
Sure. We approach our projects based on problem solving. So we hear things like, we have pet stains. We don't have enough package space in the lobby. Our lighting is dim. So the core of the project is to determine what the problems are. And then the solutions are, so for example, if you're going to talk about hallways, and we've seen hallways that had paper wall covering versus a commercially rated 20-ounce vinyl wall covering that's got a texture to it, that's going to cover a lot of imperfections in the walls, and that is cleanable. Carpet, I absolutely agree with the 80% wool, 20% nylon Axminster carpet versus nylon. And David is right. The Axminster cost compared to nylon, nylon is a petroleum product, and we all know where the gas prices are and the oil prices are. So, you're thinking if you're getting a bargain by buying nylon, you're not necessarily getting a bargain. With an Axminster carpet, we always design with a texture or a pattern texture meaning a visual texture, so that it covers sins. It covers day in and day out soil and lint, and certainly pet stains. And an 80-20 Wool Axminster is very favorable to cleaning up pet stains, and it is even somewhat bleach impervious. We've been doing it for 30 some odd years, and we've never gotten a call back that there's been a bleach problem with an Axminster carpet. So those are the kinds of problem solving that we like to do, and we do it with classic colors, things that are soothing, Zen-like, or period of the building, but fresh and today. I mean, I call some of the traditional buildings that we work on, it's a fresh, traditional design palette, as opposed to a classically traditional design palette. And also pattern in whether it's in your carpet, whether it's in wall covering, also in the lobby, upholstery furniture. Upholstered furniture is another area that's a problem. You've got kids, you've got guests, you've got people with pens in their back pocket, you've got all types of possibilities for damage. And so it's your design team really needs to know the products that are out there that are available. And the good news, as what David said, is because generally speaking, you have miles of carpet and miles of wall covering, and to do something custom and unique and special to the building is something that one can expect to do.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel the same way? I don't know, Marilyn, if you have as much experience with roof deck furniture, but similarly usage up there. Like, I remember one of the buildings that we had, it was beautifully done, but the furniture, flew. So, again, I guess capturing good design, and I don't know, David, if this is more something you speak to, but, considering things like, your furniture flying off or, the flow of package rooms right now, are just the little things that, yes, there's beautiful elements to design, but then there's the reality impacts of how you design and what you design. So, either going to the roof deck furniture concept, or maybe just speaking to flow and how you fix the flow. What are your thoughts about that? Because these are really important factors to consider, not just beauty, but, the actual impact of your design.
Yeah, I think on the roofs, I think everyone has the same thing. Roof looks great the first day you did it, but if you made the roof and all the fencing or the planters out of wood, even if you maintain them over 5 years, they're never going to look as good as day one, like the building you were talking about. Same thing with furniture, which sometimes have to be taken in and out if it's, if there's no space for it. So now you have stuff outdoors through the winter time. So, I try to encourage the building again to order something, let's say in powder coated aluminum with a sunbrella fabric, something that's really going to hold up. It's more of an investment, but there are kind of middle end commercial furniture companies that offer that type of fairly robust furniture. And I think, materials outdoors, they're in the weather all the time, in the rain. And, there are more and more products that hold up over time, but again, it's more of an investment than, just necessarily like a crate and barrel sofa. So
right. So those might not be like the general companies you would think of, might not be the best places to source.
Correct. There are more and more companies that are kind of set up to sell this kind of outdoor, garden type, durable quality furniture, planters, other types of things. When we make planters, we used to make more out of wood. Now a lot are being made out of aluminum or fiberglass or ceramic. So again, more durable materials.
And as far as care is concerned, I remember, Marilyn, you do something that's fantastic for clients, which is, teaching them the importance of maintaining what they invested in.
Yes.
I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Would love to. While listening to David, I couldn't help but think, it dawned on us after having some phone calls from clients, 6 months into a project, that they were experiencing in one particular case that their wall covering was showing, the super called and said it's bleeding. The walls are bleeding. So I went over and I looked at the wall covering and took a sample of it, had it tested by the manufacturer. Manufacturer came in, And everything was absolutely fine with the wall covering until I said to the superintendent, can you show me how you're cleaning the wall covering? And he brought a crystal clear bucket of water and pink method soap. So he was actually adding the blood, if you will, or the red marks onto the walls. That inspired us to support every project that we do with a written maintenance manual. And the written maintenance manual will tell them the color temperature of the bulbs. It will tell them all the paint colors that are used. It will tell them all the fabrics and all the materials and exactly how they should be cleaned and what product to use. That has eliminated all of those follow-up phone calls that I've got. So,
and then we're bleeding of walls. Who would have thought?
Exactly. So to support our design going forward, this maintenance manual is what I call the Bible.
That's great. That's, I think, such a fantastic thing, because I remember one time, again, I feel all these buildings I worked on have had issues, but beautiful white wood, you know, without maintenance care. And of course we started bleaching the wood, and this is another new construction. Ouchies to this beautiful wood, we ruined it. But so it's really important to show maintenance care. I think that's such a fantastic tip. I really, really do. And I know, David, you're an expert in lighting. So when it comes to designing fixtures, how do you make ugly things like wiring and, you know, look good in old buildings, not just like new ones I was speaking to, but what are your tips of the trade for that?
It used to be more difficult because in order to get, let's say, a recessed light in a ceiling was, 6 or 8 inches. Now with the advent of LEDs, I mean, you can get some that are 2 inches, at 3 or 3.5, you're getting like a fully robust LED fixture. A lot of these buildings have, let's say, about an 8-foot ceiling, it's concrete, and then they also have, wiring is being upgraded all the time, but they only have a plastic molding or a crown molding. It might be a post-war building that really doesn't really want a crown molding per se, and they're trying to come up with a wiring solution. So, and wiring is being upgraded, files and so on. So by dropping the ceiling, let's say 3 inches, you can put a very, sophisticated LED that has a wall washing lens that can actually throw like even light all around. And then you actually create enough room to run all wires from a remote closet to each apartment and have an access panel over the door. So in the future, if you want to run new wires or connect different services like Fios or Spectrum, you don't have to touch your investment, which is, the wall covering or the ceiling. Everything's kind of pre-run. So again, you handle the lighting in a very sophisticated way. Also, what Marilyn was mentioning, the vinyl wall coverings, they look like silk now, and so when you get a really nice LED, they have what's called a CRI, or a color rendering index, and they can actually render the colors really beautifully. And these LEDs now can last 10, 20 years without relamping, to even 80% of their life. So it's, it is somewhat of an investment, but it's a dramatic investment. I always say start with the lighting, because I think it kind of sets up your whole palette to be successful.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like for a certain time period, a lot of developers at least were going with darker ambiance. And I don't know if that's so effective for, where we are today, especially with these new legislations that have regulations on lighting. But, how do you work with buildings when they have built-in challenges that, such as lighting? That sounds like an easy fix, but then it might change the way the overall appearance is, because the hallway was intended to look dark and now we're changing it. So how do you work problems like that? Another problem that comes to mind is low ceiling heights. In those types of buildings, you're saying it's an 8-foot clearance. That's not so much. And then you're lowering the ceiling in essence. So how do you course correct? I don't know, Marilyn, you were nodding your head.
Yeah, I'm nodding my head because
Yeah.
often, there are budget constraints, and I know David mentioned that it is an investment, and it is an investment. But often clients can't necessarily justify some of the expense, and so we use the existing light sources where
Mhm.
there may be existing surface mounted fixtures that have fluorescent light bulbs in it or first generation LED bulbs in it. We actually use hospitality resources, which are hotel resources, where we can custom design decorative fixtures with an LED light board as opposed to a bulb, which gets that 10 years plus lifespan and is also easily changed. But you get a far superior lighting. Many times you'll see lighting that has solid sides, and so the light is only going down. Whereas if you design a fixture that lets light go through the sides as well as the bottom, you're getting a lot more spill. You're getting a lot more for your buck, if you will, bang for your buck with that fixture. So whether it's existing sconces or whether you have a budget to add sconces strategically, you can do that as well. So there are many different ways to approach lighting.
Great tips. All right, so now for the fun part. Let's see some sample before and after work. I know both of you have a lot of really gorgeous work that you've done previously. So I guess we'll start with Marilyn's first.
So here's an example of, on the left-hand side are the before photos. So here you see a surface mounted light fixture. You see plastic crown cable molding, nylon carpet, you can't tell, but trust me, it's nylon carpet with carpet base, which is also something that was generations ago. And this is really a very special 1960s building. And the assignment was they wanted to embrace it wholeheartedly. So here we designed, this is an 80% wool, 20% nylon, custom designed carpet for them with that kind of fun 60s feel to it. Their lobby has wood paneling, so we actually brought that same wood paneling up into the hallways at the elevator landings. That has actually, to David's point, a silk look wall covering on the walls. And then to identify the elevator areas, we did cove lighting, down lighting, a combination of down lighting, and at each apartment door, we added an ADA compliant sconce, meaning it's no greater than 4 inches deep, but it has that 60s kind of look. And underneath it has the apartment number. So it's really a very unique, we were given an opportunity to really work on a very unique building, including changing the doors and the hardware.
Yeah, I noticed. It looks night and day. It doesn't look like the same building at all.
Exactly.
And the lighting is so much brighter.
Yes. Yes. And what's also fun about this type of project is if you have the budget, you can play with the lighting so that it's not all one source. It's not all overhead. You can do sconces, you can do cove, you can do downlights. And that gives visual interest on your way from the elevator to your apartment or back outside.
Wow, that's great. It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
I believe, David, you have your hallway work next. Also very beautiful. So do you want to maybe speak to your project?
Sure. So this was the start off kind of looks like Maryland's project and kind of colors.
Like so many New York buildings.
Yes.
This project had a gridded acoustical 2x2 grid, ceiling. Terrible carpet, terrible wall covering. A lot of the doors were no longer fireproof. So we had to re-fireproof or reorder a bunch of doors. They were a big fan of the mail chute. So we had the mail chute actually refinished in its kind of original brass finish. We installed a new drop ceiling that's a sheetrock ceiling with integrated LED lighting.
So sorry to interrupt, did that make the appearance feel lower though? I know people get fearful of the word drop ceiling.
It was at the same height as the maybe about 2 inches lower than the acoustical ceiling, and you're right, people always are worried about that. I actually also proposed, which you can see, kind of a beam across to define the elevator lobby, which some people are also kind of worried that it's going to compress the space, but the lighting actually makes the space much larger and much more luxurious. We added the sconces like Marilyn mentioned, and actually in terms of lighting, though it's not a lighting element, mirrors in this case actually kind of spread the light as well. We use the same type of textured silk vinyl wall covering, but we mixed the colors, so the entry has kind of a more golden hue, and then the side hallways have more of a greenish hue to them. This happens to be a nylon carpet. I like the pattern, and we kind of divided it up with the border just to make it a little more kind of pre-war feeling. And then we had all new moldings, new signage, and new door hardware for the project.
Beautiful. And I know, Marilyn, you spoke about the branding elements earlier, and I'm a firm believer in this concept as well, because buildings, you know, again, you have to continuously breathe life into them because they're obviously your home foremost, but then they're also an investment. And so when people want to sell competitively, you know, oftentimes they'll say, but the building across the street from me, you know, is selling at X. Why are we only selling at this? You know, what can we do differently? And a lot of times, you know, it's not just snapping your fingers and saying, I want the same price as my neighbor. You know, you have to invest in your property. And so this comes into play with the branding elements that you spoke of earlier. You know, how do you, in essence, rebrand an older property, you know, like this, so you can be competitive with your newer building counterparts or with the buildings that are continuously making improvements. And I mean, these are both great starting points. And you, David, had mentioned different signage, you know, is also contributing to an overall brand aesthetic for the building. So you don't have to be a new building to have a brand, right? You can be an existing property and still be able to make improvements so you could be competitive in the marketplace.
Actually, that's one of the questions that we ask in our first couple of meetings is, who is your competition and what do they look like? And have they been renovated and updated, and how long ago? And you'd be surprised. I'm speaking with a building right now who, in order to justify doing a major renovation, they're actually going to take photos of the competition in the neighborhood to show the board, to say, hey, look at us and look at them. And it's a no-brainer. And then the other part of it is you are branding, and branding, certainly the brokers talk to each other and know the market very well, but a lot of millennials and buyers go to the internet. And if you look at your Street Easy or Zillow presence, where you see the front of your building with a barricade on the front and a car, that's who you are to the world. And so the branding starts from the inside of the building, but it also, I think your web presence is also critical.
Agreed. Yeah. I mean, especially to different, you know, demographics that you're selling to. You have to kind of cater to everyone if you're trying to sell, you know, effectively. Right. So I 100% agree. So I believe another beautiful lobby, I believe, is this your work, Marilyn?
Sorry. Yeah, this is our work on the left-hand side. Oh my goodness. This lobby was completely reconfigured. They had a very small doorman station and a tiny package closet behind him that abutted their mailroom. And then what you're looking at in the left-hand side is actually the old lobby. And they had such overflow in packages, they went out and bought a Japanese shoji screen to put up so that they could put the stuff behind it. So what we did is we actually flipped everything. We took the mailroom, and what you see on the right-hand side behind the mirror and the grill work is actually a new fully fledged up-to-date US postal regulation mailbox mailroom. Oh, wow. And on the left-hand side where the mailroom was, which was a significant amount of space, we created a walk-in closet. And seating, you don't need a ton of seating in a lobby, especially post-COVID. It's really more of an image. There is a place to perch. There are places for people to sit, but it doesn't have to be, you know, several sofas and a whole living room arrangement. It can be quite conservative in that respect. And so, and here we also did a porcelain floor tile, which is no maintenance, a wet mop. So we really utilized the space and used materials that are long lasting.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned that because I've been walking buildings lately and noticing that they do not have a lot of furniture in their spaces purposely, and that the congregation of the lobbies is not as, desired anymore, and they want to have more room, especially given, all of our desires to have packages all the time sent from Amazon. So kind of to take that space and give it new life and give it purpose. And instead of having multiple seating arrangements, having an area dedicated to compartmentalizing the mess. So, and also not having your packages stolen potentially or misplaced. So having a real room dedicated. I think that is a beautiful transition, and also a good use of space because, I guess we can speak to trends, but, things aren't always, it's not always good to build according just to trend, because we're always rejuvenating what was trendy a few years ago. But I think, going in purpose with what is going on today and acclimating your spaces purposely, like in the situation that you did, is both on trend, but also I think will last the duration of time. So I think that's a really effective use of space. Beautiful. And now, David, I believe we have a rooftop next for you, which is very fun. And I know that during COVID, that has been a key requirement for a lot of buildings is outdoor space. This is beautiful. So tell us about this.
This is an interesting project because we had enough room to actually raise the pavers above the actual roof deck about 30 inches. So we started basically with a blank slate. We put a new waterproof membrane in, a roof that's got a liquid membrane, usually has 20 to 30 year warranty. And if you have to do things during the life of the roof, if you get the same people back, you can actually maintain the warranty. So it's it was a very important thing to kind of start with a roof that we know is going to hold up. And then from there, since we could raise the deck 30 inches, we were able to put all the plantings flush with the deck. So the actual planters are less expensive. They're fiberglass, they're hidden into the ground. So we actually have trees that we were able to bring up in the elevator because it was less expensive to do that. We have a fireplace that's actually a gas fireplace, and so it meets a lot of New York City fire codes. Pretty easy to pass code, and you don't need any special ventilation requirements. And then we used a louver screen to either side of the fireplace, which is actually a louver that you'd use for an HVAC screen, and we had it power coded and black lit, so it actually looks more like a custom element. The nice thing about all these things, including the porcelain tiles which you see, is they're all durable elements. So this is built to last 15, 20, 30 years. It does have maintenance. The stone needs to be maintained. There is a small area of teak here, but aluminum and other finishes will have a much longer lifespan and less maintenance over time. In this case, we actually have apple trees either side of the fireplace, and then you have what's called clump birches flanking this pathway with wild grasses, and then we created what I'm doing in some other common roof terraces is, it's hard to see, but there's a perimeter green screen that basically is taller than anything you see in the before picture. And so all you see along the perimeter walls is ivy and grass. So it kind of deconstructs your space. You don't really feel like you're on a physical roof. So that's what I think is an interesting opportunity, to be able to raise the pavers and kind of put this green screen all around. Kind of really takes, you could be really anywhere, it's a very internal space. Now, certain roofs have better views, and so you want to take advantage of that. But there's a lot of opportunities. A lot of buildings are now looking at their roofs and rethinking them because it's such a great amenity, and doing things like adding even some heat lamps, and or the fireplace can also extend the life, so it's 6-8 months that you can have up on the roof.
Right. We live in New York City and it's still cool, except for today, of course.
Yeah.
All right. So now that I love both of your work, I think you put obviously a lot of thought behind your design, but it's also durable, which is very important because, again, going back to the sad, beautiful ivory carpet that had to be removed before sale. It was sad. So we're going to start to do our Q&A because I'm sure people have questions for each of you. And one of the questions we received was, do you have any advice regarding the design of pre-war lobbies in particular?
Marilyn?
I'll jump in. Well, pre-war lobbies, depending on the size of it, often we find that there are gorgeous floors, whether they're terrazzo or marble or tile, that if they're in good shape, there is no reason to change them. Often there are marble walls, and if they're in good shape, no reason to change them. If they are damaged, then we would bring somebody in on that. I think in most buildings, whether pre-war or post-war, and post-war meaning 60s and young and older, package space is always a disaster and a nightmare. And also the proximity of the doorman to an existing package closet. Often a package closet is around the bend and down the hall. And with today, with the influx of, guests and deliveries, I don't like to see the doorman anywhere else but closer to the door for security reasons, even if it's perceived security. So creating package space as close as possible to the doorman, whether it's freestanding cabinetry, which is something you don't have to file with the building department, or if you create an actual room where you have sheetrock walls and doors and what have you, that would have to be filed with the building department. So there are different ways of dealing with it. Often pre-wars have a lot of space, and that's the good news. And pre-wars have a lot of space, and that's the bad news. The bad news is that you've got more space to fill and to renovate, and there's cost with that. When it's a smaller, but you can get the package space and the seating area and a proper doorman station all fit in easily. So that's the good news.
Great tip. And you agree, David? Oh, I think you're on mute.
I think the pre-war buildings, especially in New York, have great bones. I mean, they're really beautiful, like, terrazzo. I mean, nothing's more exciting than terrazzo floors, but, they might look good in one area, but as you start to uncover them, they may not in another area. So I think being smart how to figure out how to maintain the beauty if you can. I think, having the room to have more of a gracious entry, which is kind of like, pre-war spaces are more gracious when you get upstairs. So I agree with what Marilyn's saying. I think it's nice to have this kind of more of a ceremonial kind of, people who buy in pre-war, I think they buy for that reason. It's more of it's more of an experience, of going here, going there, and getting up to your apartment. So, I think you have the opportunity to change, but still create that experience, so enlarge the package room. I like spaces that maybe don't even have seating, but they're just empty and beautiful. We never talk about it, but it's nice just to have like 8 or 10 feet of just openness, and I think sometimes just to tuck the buildings into that too, that it's just so beautiful to keep it simple and, plus maisonettes that way too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you just suggested something that might be a bang for your buck, experience where you are creating a beautiful space, but you're not having to invest in the furniture. So that might be a more cost-effective way of restoring and improving, what you have. What are other examples that you might have of, so to speak, getting your bang for your buck?
I think, again, I think when you come in, the experience of just basically from the street. So do you have a revolving door? A lot of people are switching to like the automated doors because that's like a lot of new buildings have them. But if you're a mother and you have a stroller and, an automated door is amazing, like that would be, I don't have young kids anymore, but that would be like a really nice feature that maybe you could do within your existing lobby, and maybe that's 15 or 20,000 versus redoing the whole lobby. The Marilyn, I think, had a smart approach when she tried to differentiate between things you have to file with the city, which costs a lot of money and time and a lot more processes and people involved, versus a freestanding non-structural solution. So cabinetry or a wall of something that can really, again, maybe feel like a piece of furniture, the opposite, rather than changing things with construction, to change it with furniture pieces and some beautiful freestanding lighting. So it could be more of a decorative project, but it can handle the packages in a better way than you have now, for example.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. What are some examples of something that a board might perceive as not being a drastic change, but then in actuality, you do have to go to the city?
If a building is landmarked, then you run into having to go to the LPC, or Landmarks Preservation Commission, on touching anything that has to do with the facade, or even 18 inches inside of the building. If it's on a land, and there are differentiations. There's landmark district versus a landmarked building, and there are restrictions with both. And so your design team should really know what those are, because they will be scrutinized. And so that's cost. Those types of buildings have an innate cost to that type of work. If you're doing furniture and furnishings, that's not an issue. So, and again, that's pretty unique to pre-war.
If you're dropping ceilings, you usually have to file, because that's a fire condition. If you're changing outdoors or moving walls, structural work. Electrical work's actually a little simpler, because the electricians file with their own department. There's no drawings. So sometimes if you're upgrading lighting or fixtures or switches, that's a little easier of a process than the Department of Building or Landmarks.
Those are good tips. Speaking of, processes, someone is asking a good question about time, so you want to get something done, but what amount of time, do you recommend for, in this case, they're talking about planning a rooftop renovation project. And are you still encountering supply chain challenges? Because, you are beholden as the board to the residents. You need to kind of give them an expectation of time. So how do you work along time schedules?
Marilyn, you want to answer this one?
Oh, well, if it's a roof thing, I would let you answer it.
Okay, no problem.
Non-roof thing, I'd be happy to answer.
Okay, I'm happy to answer. It's trying to be egalitarian here. I think, first of all, it's very hard to flush out a budget and a scope, which Marilyn had talked about before. And I think, a lot of times the board has all the ideas and they have a budget, but those don't, and a timeline, and they don't always meet together. So it's trying to kind of clarify that, build confidence in what they're spending, if they have a certain budget that, it's worth the money. And then, having some flexibility with the suppliers and with the board. So with pavers, for example, I have a 5,000 square foot building. There's only, 3 or 4 pavers that we can find that are in stock, but one's made in New Jersey, one's in South Carolina. So we can get them in like 2 or 3 weeks. One's $7 a square foot, one's $14 a foot. So we have samples and they can decide. And, it's kind of, you have to present more options than you would in the past. You actually have to work harder, almost double work sometimes, because you want to give them a way to move through that. And some things like the pergola that we're looking at, 18 weeks, but they want to be on the roof by the end of the summer, middle of the summer. So that will just come later in the process. So, but they don't need that then. So it's a lot of communicating and trying to see what's going to make you happy, what really can we get you, in one shot. And then if there's other things that are going to take a little longer, they don't necessarily slow down the whole project, so, and trying to look out for anything that's like a critical path, right? So lead times don't necessarily matter unless it's like the thing you need to do to get to the next thing. So it's trying to figure out what that is, making sure those things, are obstacles, that those things are covered, and yeah, it's harder now, but I think, having kind of a theme and a feeling, and then having a client that understands you might get a planner that looks like this, or it might look a little different, but it's going to look and feel the same in the end, that you're selling a feeling and an experience, not a particular paver or a particular plan or a particular awning, that's how I would approach it.
Being more flexible, I guess, is what you
Yeah,
have
more
to say.
flexibility for sure. And more communication about, all the time. Well, now I can't get this, but I can get this. Things are changing a lot all the time.
And so you as designers will educate your board and say, your client rather, and you'll say, this is what we're seeing, and these are, our recommendations at this point.
Yeah, we can say, look, if you have to be in by this time, then these are the things that you need to purchase, and this is the cost. If you're willing to wait this much longer, you might have some savings or more design choices in terms of what you want to pick, but these are the parameters that you have to kind of work within if you want to reach your goal, and
yeah, and I remember, Marilyn, we had a conversation previously about this, and I think you had a really good point is, it is going to, maybe right now the supply chains are, not helping us as much, but it's still worth the value in the long run, because you think about amortizing design over a certain period of time. People are usually looking at things as like a snap judgment, like it's going to cost me X today, and you don't think about the value it's going to bring to the building over time. So I don't know if you wanted to speak to that, but I think that was a really valuable point.
Sure. I find, and I'd love to address both things and provide some kind of concrete answers from my experience. On the budget end of it, I find that we prepare a preliminary budget estimate based on our experience and what we see and how we envision the design. And when we give that budget number, we know that board members and residents will kind of gasp, clutch their chest, and feel that X amount of dollars is all coming out of their individual pocket, when in fact, that's not the reality. The reality is it will be the budget either comes from a reserve or it would come from an assessment, and that number is something that if you take it and break it down into a very small unit, it makes sense. So for example, if you're doing it by shares, or if you're doing it by a unit's cost, but you amortize it over the 20 years, it ends up being a tiny amount of money. But the initial shock of what that number is, which a lot of zeros at the end, can be very daunting. And I think if boards approach it by breaking it down into, we're not doing this for another 15 to 20 years, all of a sudden it becomes a lot more palatable. And in terms of time, my experience with timing on projects, and I'm asked this all the time, our projects have been running from the day we're hired, and I'm talking about lobby and hallway projects, from the day we're hired, mostly a hallway project, I would say, from the day we're hired through the design process, through the bidding process, the procurement process, and construction is generally about 18 months. It could be a little bit longer. And I would say 50% of that is design time and procurement and bidding. And the rest of that time is the actual physical construction. And I think people like to know, how does this affect me? How am I going to be inconvenienced? How long are you going to be on my floor? How long is this going to take? And those are really legitimate questions. So when we work with a building, and David's absolutely right, communication is key. And I think if you answer those questions, as much of that up front, you do build confidence and you calm everyone down. Also, in terms of starting a project, it's very important that you have as much of the material in hand before you even lift a hammer. Because the last thing you want to do is to start a project, stop, lose your workers, wait for product, and you're in a war zone. So it really is managing a project almost like to really minimize the aggravation and minimize the discomfort. And that all falls back on the board. Whatever happens that we're doing as designers, it's all the board's fault. So we want to protect the board as much as possible by laying it out logically with a timeline with contractors. And also when the contractors' contracts are being finalized with the building's attorneys, they do put in clauses about how long things are going to take, and there may be a schedule included in that. So it's not just the designer. We can just do so much, but we're not painting and laying carpet. It's the contractors that need to be structured so that the project does go on time.
Excellent point. And yeah, I mean, again, you have to also, to your point, make sure that the contract stipulates timing. So people make sure that they are on schedule.
Exactly.
Yeah, because I think people, always want to have grand plans, but the reality is Rome wasn't built in a day, as everyone says. And so it will take time. It's not like you're going to plan, budget, and get, a brand new lobby in 3 months from now. It's going to take time. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I love getting final tips from people. So I guess as we enter, this spring market, which for me was, big time for selling, what are some tips that you would recommend boards look at, while they think about improving their buildings and looking at their budget effectively? Do you have any last minute tips you would give? I don't know who wants to go first, but Marilyn, I guess
I'll
you're
go
not.
first.
Okay.
We're now in April, May. The design process does take time, as you mentioned. And if you are thinking about a project now, construction will start in January. So just so you get an idea, because of you're going through the design process with the designer and the procurement and any building department filing and things that need to be done. Buildings, we talk about, do you want to start this during the holidays? Do you want to start in September during Jewish holidays? Do you want to have it Thanksgiving? Do you want the building to be ripped up during Christmas? So there's a lot to it. And so I would think if you are planning a design project now, you may want to think about when is the best time to actually physically lift the hammer and start the construction work.
That's a great point. Do you have a particular time of year you think is the most effective?
It's funny. People say, do you have a season? Is there like a design season? And I say, no, it's either we're designing to start in January or designing in the beginning of the year to do it during the summer when people are on vacation and people are away and kids are in camp. So it's a constant, and it really has to do with the preference of the building. I've had buildings that have started work the week before Christmas because they promised. And so be it, and it gets done. But excuse me. It's really very based on what the building has promised the residents.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I wouldn't even think about that, to be honest, but it makes 100% sense. You don't want to have building be disruptive during Christmas.
Right.
Or again, during like peak sales season when people are trying to get their value in their building, their investment return.
Right.
David, do you have any last tips you can share with us?
Yeah, I think if we think about design and where it's come from, New York historically has been a great place for design. That's why I moved here. But I think design kind of began to change with the iPhone and Steve Jobs, and this idea of like brand and you slice through it, it's kind of the same thing. And I think that buildings, more and more are creating like a brand. You look at Ryan Surratt, and and he's in movies inside his own building that he's marketing. So more and more of an experience. And I think you can only achieve so much when you're in an older building and you're limited in certain ways. So I think you have to be smart, and I think you have to be a little brave, to go out there and come up with a design and a solution that's unique, so that you can compete with these other buildings and be current and last into the future. So I think you got to be smart and be brave.
Great. Those are great tips. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you, Marilyn and David. Your tips have been phenomenal. As always, we thank you for your time. And if you have any remaining questions, please email us and we'll be happy to get you in touch with these fabulous designers for more information.